Okay, we're going to do something a little bit different today. I'm currently in the process of restoring this old BMX bike. I bought this frame about 4 years ago and I built it up very badly. I didn't treat the frame, I didn't paint the frame, it just came raw steel like this. So after a few years it was covered in rust and the cranks that I had on this bike had completely seized inside the bottom bracket. After angle grinding them off and soaking this frame in various rust removing products, I used a combination of Evapo Rust, which worked really well, but unfortunately it left these marks on the actual bike because I was going to leave this frame raw again and just treat it to a clear top coat. But because of these marks that have been left behind from the Evapo Rust, I'm gonna paint it. The other product I used to get rid of some of the rust in these hard to reach places here was Hammerite Rust Removal Gel. It worked really well. I just had to keep applying it every half an hour to an hour and just keep slapping it on, and it did get rid of the majority of the rust from those sections. The next thing I did, I sanded it down with a rough grit and then a smoother grit paper. I think I ended up with 250 grit paper. Brushed it with wire wool and then cleaned the whole frame with rubbing alcohol. So now we are ready to paint this frame. I haven't given much thought to the sanding of this frame. It was in pretty bad condition anyway. It's a BMX bike, it's going to pick up dings. I'm not that fussed as to how the finish comes out. I just want it to look a little bit neater. So we're going to learn how to paint a bike together. They say the best way of learning is to make mistakes, and I'm sure I'm going to make lots of them. Alright, so I'm going to make these mistakes for you so that you don't have to. Let's get down to it. So the frame I'm using is an S&M LTF, lighter than fuck frame. It was a great frame. It is super light. They're quite hard to find these days. So all the prep work has been done to this frame. I've masked off as best I can the headset, the bottom bracket, and the seat post here, seat tube here. What I'm planning on doing is I'm going to hit this with some high build primer. Now this is like a filling primer. What it's going to do is it's going to fill in some of these scratches and imperfections on the frame to give me a nice smooth coat to build my paint off of. The next thing I'm going to hit it with is some anti-rust primer. There are still some specks of, I wouldn't call it rust, but oxidization on the frame. So I just want to use an anti-rust primer just to make sure that that rust doesn't come through the paintwork once I'm done. And the actual paint I'm going to be using is called Rover Arum White. It's kind of a beigey off-white colour. And after I hit it with the paint, I'm going to run it with a clear top coat to protect the paint. All the aerosols and paints that I'm using are from Halfords. They are cheap, so this will be a good test to see how they turn out. To start off with, I'm just going to hit it with some high build primer. I'm going to start off with a lighter coat, then the second coat will be slightly thicker, and the third, possibly final coat, will be the thickest. 3 to 4 coats of this high build primer. And I want to spray roughly 7 to 10 inches away from the actual frame. Shake well for at least 2 minutes. So from what I gather from painting in the past, I've also done a guitar project that I completely repainted. You want to spray off the project and work your way around it. So you want to start here and spray across. This little start spray gets rid of any droplets and then end past your piece. I'm going to move the camera now not to get any paint on it. Okay, that's my first coat of primer done. Very light. I'm going to leave that for about 20 minutes, half an hour, and then come back and hit it with a second coat. Okay, it's been about 20 minutes. I've left this first coat of high build primer to dry, and I'm going to hit it with my second coat. Okay, it's time for my final coat of high build primer. I'm going to spray this one quite thick, maybe 4 to 5 inches away from the actual frame while spraying, and then leave that to dry before we move on to the anti-rust primer. So I've just hit this with the third and final coat of the high build primer. Pretty much used the whole can, just kept spraying it on, nice and thick. Looks pretty good, got a nice good coverage on it. Okay, I've let that heavy coat of high build primer sit here for about 20 minutes. And now I'm going to hit it with the first coat of the anti-rust primer. Again, 3 coats of that, light on the first one, slightly heavier on the second, and the third coat will be the heaviest. Shake it. Okay, now that first coat of the anti-rust primer has dried, it's time to hit it again with a second, slightly thicker coat. Okay, now it's time for my final coat of primer. Okay, I've just applied the last coat of primer. After I've let this dry for about 20 to 30 minutes, I'm going to take some very fine grit sandpaper, wet dry, wet it, and I'm going to just rub down the frame just to smooth it out a little bit more and remove any dust or hairs that might have got stuck to the frame whilst painting. And I'm just going to rub down some of the rough areas on the primer with this 600 grit sandpaper. It's wet dry. I'm going to start off sanding dry, and then I'm going to use a separate piece, wet it a little bit, and go back over the frame. Okay, I've got my wet piece of sandpaper now. Just going to give it another light sanding. Okay, now that I've wet and dry sanded it with 600 grit sandpaper, the next thing I want to do is just clear all this primer dust off of the frame, and for that I'm going to use some rubbing alcohol on a cloth. I'm just going to rub down the frame before applying the colour. Just using the rubbing alcohol, it dries very quickly, so you don't have to worry about leaving your frame to dry. It also will remove any grease, dust and fingerprints that you might have left on the frame before you apply your colour, or your top coat, or whatever you want to call it. I was very careful when I sanded, but there is one small spot where I went through to bare metal, just here where I think someone used to have brake mounts on this bike and they've grinded them off the frame. It's just worn down to bare metal a slight bit there. I'm not too worried about it. We'll see how it looks once the project's finished. Okay, the rubbing alcohol is pretty much completely dried on this frame, so I'm going to start hitting it with my colour coat. I'm using this Halford's Arum White. It's a car colour that has been matched to a vintage Rover Arum car. It's kind of a beige, off-white, yellowy white, and again we have to shake this. Now I'm going to start spraying my colour coat. Again, I'm going to aim for 3 coats on this. First coat very light, second coat a bit heavier, third coat the heaviest. Right, now it's time for my second coat of colour. Okay, I've just applied my second coat of colour and the paint tin had ran out. So, first note, 1 can is not enough. Second note, should have used a white base primer because it's going to take me more top coats to get the colour nice and thick on this grey. Another point, when the can is running out, just stop spraying. Don't try and get closer and put it on nice and thick, because eventually a big glob will fly through the nozzle and you'll end up with a drip like I've got here. So I'm going to leave this for a few days just to harden up. I'm going to go and buy some more top coat and do a few more coats. There is also quite a few hairs and some dust on here, so I might give it another fine wet and dry sand, a few more coats of colour, and by the time you come back for the next video, this frame would have been coloured and will be ready for clear coating. So watch this space. Next Wednesday there'll be another BMX bike build video. And remember to live deliberately.